You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode number 70. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. I am so glad to have you all here today and really excited to welcome our very special guest. Her name is Suzi Nixon. She is a lawyer. She works out of Kentucky in the US. She has made the transition from big law to running her own firm. She is also trained as a coach, and she is the founder of a wonderful community called Legally Blissed. And she has a podcast of the same name, which I've been listening to in preparation for today. And it's an excellent podcast. I highly recommend it. Welcome, Suzi. So nice to have you here.
Thank you so much, Paula. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
It is such a pleasure. And I've kind of given a bit of an introduction, Suzi, but there's so much more than what I've just described. I would love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself, where you started out, and the work that you're doing now.
Sure. So I started out practicing law as a patent prosecutor for a couple of years right out of law school. And I quickly transitioned into trademark law, and I worked in a big firm for about 8 years. And trademark law was a much better fit for me. There are great patent prosecutors, patent attorneys out there. I was not going to be one of them. So I really hit my stride in doing the trademark work. After being in that law firm for, like I said, about 8 years, I was getting pretty close to partnership and was starting to have second guesses about whether or not that's the track I wanted, right? I just didn't envision myself kind of like in the corner office with the big oak desk and the leather bound books. It didn't appeal to me. I always wanted to be someone who kind of paved their own path, right? So this was about 2010, 2011, and I decided I was going to go solo with my laptop. And even at that point, people were like, okay, you're crazy to leave six figures. And I was like, no, I can do this. I was in a point in my life where I think a lot of people from the outside kind of looking at me might have seen it as super high risk, but I wasn't taking care of any other humans other than myself. And I was always like, what's the worst that could happen? I could live in a van down by the river and it would probably be just fine. It wouldn't be that big of a deal. So I did take the leap and I went solo, started my own practice, and it has been, there's been a lot of ups and downs. It's been sort of a feast or famine kind of situation until probably about 2015, I decided I would niche my area. So trademark law isn't really a niche, right? Like I think a lot of people are like, oh, well, if you practice in this area, it's a niche, or another area, it's a niche. It's like, no, you need to niche even further. Like if you think you are niched enough in your practice or your business, like take it one step further. So I started offering trademark services specifically for people who were doing e-commerce on Amazon. And I know we probably don't want to get too far down the entrepreneurial path, but I've always considered myself an entrepreneur who just happens to be a lawyer. So I was really able at that point to learn and speak the language of my clients. And as lawyers, I think that's really, really important, especially in terms of business development. It really helps you resonate with them. And when I was able to do that, there were so many people that wanted to come to me for trademark work because they knew that I understood their unique problems in dealing with private label, importing, e-commerce, selling on Amazon. The list kind of goes on, brand gating, having to deal with counterfeits, all of that. So my practice really kind of exploded at that point. So never be afraid. Like if you're solo, don't be afraid, or you have a small firm, don't be afraid to niche and then niche a little further and just really learn about your clients and speak their language.
That is such a fabulous story, Suzi. I love what you're saying about really getting to know your clients, really understanding their language. And it's so true when you're able to connect with the people that you serve in a way that they feel seen, they feel heard, they feel understood. And what also jumps up about your story is to be so bold, right? Back in 2010, before the pandemic, before people were all working from home with their laptops, like you're a real trendsetter.
Yeah.
And I would love to know, because I have lawyers that I speak with, that I work with, who are thinking about making a transition. They're thinking about going solo, for example, and it seems so daunting, right? Because you have to start from scratch. And for you to make that decision after, it sounds like about 8 years of practice, and to decide, right? It's me and my laptop. What was it about that helped you decide? Like, how did you know that that was the right move for you?
I enjoyed, despite being an introverted person, I enjoyed the business development aspect, and I wanted to wear a different hat other than lawyer, right? Like I wanted to do all the other things. I also, like, although we can learn infinite things in our practice area, even with trademark law, I couldn't study it and learn all the things in my entire life. I still felt like I wanted to learn other things about running a business and business ownership, right? Even if that meant I had to learn administrative stuff, right? Or even if that meant I had to kind of learn what PR was. I loved all that. I loved getting to put on those different hats, right? Well, I mean, after a while, I kind of was like, I really don't want to put on the administrative hat. But when you start your own practice, especially if you're by yourself, and even if you might have a partner too, like you kind of have to get in there and get your hands dirty and learn, business development and then billing and all that, right? Because when you're in a law firm, someone takes care of all of that. When you're starting on your own, you get to wear all the hats. But the thing is, you learn what you love and you learn what you don't like, right? And you ultimately can hire out where you need help and really just dig into the areas that you do love in your practice.
That is so great. And Suzi, you hit on something that I think is so key, especially for any lawyers who are thinking about making that transition, which is loving that entrepreneurial aspect of it, right? You said you're like an entrepreneur who is also a lawyer. Yeah. And there are clients that I'm working with, I'm thinking of one in particular who describes herself the same way, right? It's like there's this entrepreneurial drive that is pushing her to separate herself from the herd and to stand out on her own. And I think it's really a big consideration and something to think about, because having made a similar transition myself in my coaching practice, it's me. I am the entrepreneur, and I never identified myself ever as an entrepreneur. And as we were talking, I'm like, do I like being an entrepreneur? I mean, the admin I could live without. But if you're looking at your professional work as something where you step into an organization and it's all set up for you and you don't deal with the invoicing, I mean, you do to an extent, but you're not responsible for sending out all the invoices. You're not responsible for making sure that, there's, I don't know, coffee in the coffee machine, whatever it happens to be. It's a big leap. And so whether you love those other elements or you learn to love those elements, I think that's a big consideration for anybody who's thinking of venturing off the organizational track, whether it's a law firm or government or in-house or some entity, right? Where you come in and you are the lawyer within that organization versus you are the lawyer who is, like you said, running your practice initially with your laptop or whatever that looks like. And so I think that's a really great question for anybody thinking about doing that to ask themselves. Another thing that you mentioned, Suzi, and this is totally off script, but it, I think, is really a great question for you, which is you mentioned that you're an introvert, and you also mentioned that you love business development. And this sparks for me because I have clients who tell me they want to learn how to do business development, but they are introverts. And so will you please share with us some ideas for introverts who want to develop business? Like, what do you do that resonates with you?
Okay. Yeah, it is an odd thing, right? Can I just say one thing, Paula, really quick? Because I don't want to let this pass about that calculus of like can I do this entrepreneurial thing? One thing that people need to kind of run into that too is, am I okay with having an income that fluctuates and that can fluctuate widely? Because so many people at the end of the day, they love that paycheck every 2 weeks from the law firm. And that can be a beautiful thing and give a lot of peace of mind. So when you're kind of thinking about, maybe I do want to, maybe I am an entrepreneur then, then I realize, or maybe I want to try that. That's something just to kind of add into that equation of, whether or not going on your own, leaving a law firm makes sense. I just had to put that in there.
Thank you so much. I think it's such a great point. It makes you think of mortgages, and I always go for the fixed-term mortgage, and yet here I am.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you have kids in private schools, right? Like, you can't be making $200 one month, you need, and when you are an entrepreneur, sometimes that income fluctuates, especially when you're just starting out. It can fluctuate a lot. So it could be like, ramen noodles one week and the next week it's Bruce Chris or whatever the equivalent is in Canada. That's just like a nicer steakhouse here. I'm not sure if it's international, but as for being an introverted person who likes business development, I mean, I look at business development almost as an investment and then reward, right? Like an investment in my time, but then there's a reward in client acquisition. And so getting that new client and just feeling that reward is almost very stimulating to me. And it kind of helps me get around and over my introversion. One thing I do too is not as much now, but when I was, first in my practice, and I guess I kind of go in waves of doing this, but, I think it's fairly easy. I have to be careful with that word. There's a lower kind of barrier of entry for introverts who want to do presentations because of our technology now, right? So getting out there and teaching people without having to be in a room of 200 people, like you can still do this online, right? By reaching out to someone who has the same audience that you do, but maybe maybe they provide them a different service and say, hey, I would love to come talk to your people about my area of expertise. And they see that as great content and they're usually going to be like, yeah, come on, this would be great for my audience. And I think us introverts seem to be it's a little bit easier to do like an online presentation versus like in person. Now, in in-person situations, this is going to sound really corny, but I almost put on a different persona. Like I almost will do like a breathing exercise and try to kind of step into this other person. There's the singer Beyonce, like, world famous. She's kind of known to be an introvert and she has her she calls it Sasha Fierce. It's like her persona that she steps into when she walks on the stage. So she almost becomes like this, like her alter ego. So in some ways I kind of had to do that, right? And just kind of step into this different person. That being said, like afterwards, I would be completely like done, right? It's like, oh, there's happy hour at 5:00 after the networking event. No way. I'm not going to be there. I will be in my hotel room, ordering room service and watching a movie. So, I think there's little things that introverts can do. And really a lot of it, I think it comes down to mindset. And I'm sure that's something that you work with, your clients on a lot is, how do I want to show up? Like what thoughts do I have to have in my head to be able to present and show up a certain way? And that just honestly, Paula, like that just takes practice. If you're an introvert and you're going out and you're doing your first presentation in front of 500 people, you're going to be sweating like crazy. That's going to be an intense situation for you. But, after a while, when you start learning kind of what works for you in terms of maybe a 5-minute meditation before, breathing exercises, mantras, things like that. And, some people might think that's kind of hokey or woo, but it works for me. And it's something that it just takes practice. The first time you do it, it's not going to work as great as it does the fifth time you do it. And then after a while, you're just going to be like, I got this.
I think that's so helpful, Suzi. I love what you've said. And I'm just going to recap a few of those. This idea of having the alter ego, I'd never thought about doing that in a social situation for a networking event, for example. And yet, why not, right? If it works for Beyonce, it maybe it'll work. Maybe it'll
she's
work.
doing something right.
Well, she's doing something right. And what you said about getting ready for that, there's some really interesting work. You're probably familiar with it by Amy Cuddy, where she talks about body language and how you can do these poses. And there's a TED Talk. So anybody who's interested, our guests, if you're interested in learning some power poses, and I've done this before and it feels kind of weird. I remember doing one of the power poses before a meeting that I was attending. And I was wondering, I sort of looked around the room and thought, are people looking at me differently? Because I had this really powerful body language. So that can really help if you're feeling a little bit intimidated. I also love what you said about it being something that you develop over time, right? Your practice of how you approach these types of situations if you find them intimidating, but also that it's contained in time, right? No social event or networking event is going to last forever, right? You can go and give yourself a timeline and say, I'll go for an hour. I'll do what I do within that hour. I'm fairly introverted. I like focusing on one conversation at a time. I find groups to be sometimes pretty intimidating. So whatever your strategy is, do that for whatever amount of time. And then I love the idea of when that is done to ask yourself, do you even want to go to the next party, right? The after party. Do you need that? Because for some people,
self-care. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, I'm married to an extrovert and he always wants to be out with all the people. And I love being with the people, but I also need that time to reflect and recharge.
Right.
And I haven't really said it out loud, but I think everyone listening probably knows, yes, I consider myself fairly introverted as well. So this is a topic that resonates with me very much. Suzi, I love where we're going, but I'm also going to take us into another direction, which is to talk a little bit about the work that you do, not only as a lawyer, but also as a coach and leader of a community of lawyers, because I think it's a really wonderful thing that you're doing. And I am very curious to know, and I know our listeners are going to be very curious to know about how you interpret your practice as a lawyer with, and I haven't introduced this yet, but you're also a coach. And so with the lens of a coach, and just a little sidebar, I remember when I was making my transition from lawyer to coach, I spoke with somebody who told me that the brain that you have for lawyering is like the opposite of the brain that you have for coaching, and that you would never be able to do the two things at once because they're so different. And I mean, I love it when people say things like that because that's your invitation to prove them wrong, right? It's like, well, no, of course that's possible and all that.
I'll make it work.
I'll make it work. And so I'd love to know from your perspective, having both of those frameworks, right? The lawyering framework and the coaching framework, what that looks like for you. And maybe I'll start just by asking about what it is that led you to get training as a coach, to go down that route initially.
Yeah. So I started coach training in 2020. I was a follower. Sounds kind of cult-like. I enjoy Brooke Castillo, who started the Life Coach School. And I really learned a lot from her in terms of how our thinking creates our reality. And when I would listen to her talk, I was like, oh my gosh, this so resonates with me. Why did I not have this 10 years ago? Like, this would have changed so much of my decision making and how I approach relationships and my responses to relationships. I mean, I remember being, 25 and, Richard didn't text me back, and me being like, why did Richard not text me back? And then my brain would go into crazy territory. Like, I'm just giving just a just kind of an intense example, of how I could have just said, oh, Richard's really busy right now. And it's like, why did it take me this long to recognize the importance of kind of coaching and being able to be the observer of your own thoughts? So that really resonated with me. And I was like, oh, I really want to learn more. I want to go deeper into this. So I enrolled in her coach certification program. I wasn't super sure if I was going to be a coach necessarily, but I knew I wanted to learn more and just get deeper. It's really funny though, because you mentioned about how like they're very different. Like being a coach and being a lawyer is very different. When I was in the certification program, there were 9 other women kind of in my cohort. There were probably 100 people going through it, but you're kind of broken up into smaller groups. But in my group, I was like always failing the kind of the practicum, because I kept wanting to give advice. Like, it was just like you said, like you have to really take off that lawyer hat and put on a totally different hat where you are trying to help your client see that they have the answer within them, right? You're helping them observe their own thinking, and that ultimately they know the answers. Whereas when we have our lawyer hat, it's like, I got the answer for you, right? Like we're problem solvers. I'm going to help you solve your stuff. I'm going to fix your problem. So coaching and lawyering are very different. And it's so funny because when I started that program, I was like, I got this. I got this coaching. Like I can do this, and I'm in there. And like, I think I failed like the first two practicums because I just had a really hard time like wrapping my head around taking advisor off. Like, even if I would think, okay, Suzi, you're a coach, and, I do kind of my own, thinking ahead of time. Like if I got nervous, I would drop into advisor. And, it was interesting. It definitely taught me a lot about myself. It was a really good experience. It was a great experience, actually.
It's so interesting that you brought up that role of advisor versus coach. And I was fascinated by that. In the coach training that I took, we learned this non-directive, I think is how they coined the term, but it really is that idea of you're not there as a coach to tell people what to do. And I think often those who have not worked with a coach assume that the coach is going to tell them, like a soccer coach, like go do these drills and kick the ball in the net. But really coaching at its core is about helping others figure out for themselves what the solutions are. And there may be a consulting or advising component to the coaching, but that coaching piece really is about holding space for that person so they can see inside their own minds. They can see their own thoughts. They can question their beliefs. They can figure out what they already know. There's a lot of that happening, and it really is different. And some of the materials that we looked at, I remember there was this one, it was sort of this T-bar. And on the one hand, there was the judger. And on the other hand, there was the learner. And as a lawyer learning this model, I think it's Marilee Adams, but I may have her Marilee Goldberg Adams. And forgive me, I'm probably getting her name wrong. But if you look her up and you look up this model, you'll see it. And there are these characteristics of the judger. And then there's the characteristics of the learner. It's very much aligned with the whole growth mindset concept. But again, it's looking at the world from these different lenses, and then realizing as a lawyer, you're trained to think a certain way, that you're in an environment where you're paid to exercise your judgment. And there's so much, we're constantly as lawyers dealing with facts versus opinions. Yes. And yet when you turn around and put your coach hat on and then you start to question things, right? You have the thought, right? Oh, Richard must be upset because he didn't text me back, versus where's the evidence for that? And that's where we get to really explore what we're thinking. And whatever stage of life you kind of sort of learn about, that it's almost that mindfulness component, it's that awareness component where you become aware of your own thinking. It's so liberating because you realize just how different the world is when you can see your own thoughts, and when you can let go of expectations of others, or let go of the assumptions that things around you are happening for a certain reason. It's like, well, no, actually, it could be a completely different reason. So I think that's a really neat example that you brought up, just in terms of the different mindsets that apply to each of them. And I imagine it's probably a benefit to you as you're working with your clients as a lawyer to also have that coaching capacity. So how do you find that shows up in your practice?
I think that's really interesting, Paula, because I almost feel like the coaching practice and mindset helps me more in my legal than vice versa, which is interesting because I paid a lot more for to learn how to be a lawyer, right? Like, how did that happen? At the end of the day, coaching, it's really to help people up-level themselves, right? Whether it's like they're wanting a career change, or maybe they don't love their job, whatever it is. It really is a way of kind of up-leveling your life. And how I've applied it in my practice, of course, one of the big components of coaching that I learned, and I sometimes feel a little silly about this, but like I really learned boundary setting. Like I would kind of do it, like not with intention. It was usually out of a reactionary state. Like, I can't believe this person behaved this way. I have to let them go, right? As opposed to proactively setting a boundary, right? Or having like the right mindset to set a boundary, or kind of setting a boundary, but not really setting a boundary when someone kind of violated boundary. It's like, okay, it's fine. But then like after going through coaching, a lot of what I learned there, I think it helped me a lot, my mental health in my law practice. I was better about setting boundaries around technology. And I think that's really important for lawyers to think about how they're responding to email, because a lot of times we might be too responsive to people. We have to set the tone kind of in our relationships with our clients and how we communicate. We have to set boundaries with colleagues. It's easy for me to talk about boundaries at this point, though, because I'm so much more established in my career. And it's different when you are an attorney right out of law school, you're working in big law, right? It's so much harder to set boundaries because, I mean, at the end of the day, you know, you don't want to lose your job. You've worked really hard and, you know, you're working, not even just big law, like any firm, you know, boundary setting in those situations, I think is so much more difficult. So sometimes I feel very like privileged to be able to come from like a place where I am more self-confident to be able to set boundaries. But by the same token, if you're like in a position where you're afraid to set boundaries, like once you start setting them and you stick with them, it's like a flywheel. Like you will become more confident, right? And then when you become more confident, you can set more boundaries. And then when you're able to stick to those boundaries, you just have more self-confidence. So sometimes that takes, of course, some people come out of law school and they're just like already super self-confident and they're ready to take on the world and they can do all the things. But so many of us out of law school, we really don't know what the heck's going on. So, and I was probably, in that latter category, right? I was the first person in my family who, worked in a big law firm, and I didn't have really, honestly, anyone to kind of talk to about the challenges that I've faced as a young lawyer. And granted, this was, early 2000s. So it's been a while, but I'm not going to tell you how old I am.
No, I love this, Suzi. I love this. We're probably the same age. I
think we are
from law school the same year. I'm like, we're probably the same age.
We did, yeah.
But nobody else needs to know. It's so interesting, Suzi. I love this discussion about boundaries. I love what you said about the relationship between confidence and boundaries. I haven't really heard it described that way before. For sure, that notion that from a place of confidence, you're able to set those boundaries. But the idea of creating the boundaries, then being what in turn builds your confidence, and I can see it almost like a zigzag going back and forth.
Yeah.
Boundaries are so challenging at all levels. And you think you reach a point where you're immune to them or that you've set them. I have a boundary issue that's just come up very recently for me, and I'm thinking about how I want to proceed with it. And there's a part of me that says to myself, okay, this is a very clear violation of your boundary. And do you want to assert yourself here? And there's another part of me that says, but what's the downside, right? This thing has happened. Right. I mean, and by violation, this is not like an egregious violation.
Yeah.
This is like literally
nobody's going to jail, right?
Like something on my calendar, right? It's nothing. It's nothing. Nobody's going to die from this, but it's that internal dialogue. And I think what is so difficult in the practice of law, especially when you are starting out, is that you are trying to prove yourself. And you wrote a really fantastic article. It's published on medium.com. We'll link to it in the show notes. I can't remember the title of it, but it has badass boundaries or something in there, which is amazing, and some really actionable practical tips. And I think it's really difficult because, like you say, you're trying to please your colleagues, the partners that you're working for. You're trying to please your clients. You're trying to establish yourself. You're trying to get more work, get more experience, and you don't want to be seen as a person that doesn't do their work. But then you end up in that challenging situation where you now have no boundaries. And how do you go from there to a person who has those boundaries and is able to assert herself, which I think is really challenging. Do you have any suggestions if you look back on, how you set yourself up now versus how things were at the beginning of your practice? Do you think, what advice would you give yourself? What do you think you might have done differently at the outset to create those boundaries?
Yeah. So with respect to setting boundaries, there is a lot of resistance, especially as a young lawyer, to do it, especially now that young lawyers are learning that, hey, there's this thing out there called boundaries. Maybe some parents teach their kids boundaries. Maybe some kids learn this stuff. I never learned this. So, I went into a corporate environment sort of ignorant. Again, this was 2003 and we didn't have podcasts and we didn't have YouTube, right? We didn't have community. We didn't have all of the things. Like, I think Facebook might have been kind of in its infancy, but maybe it was only if you had a .edu, right? Or something like that as as your email address. So the resources were kind of sparse, but now like looking back, like for young lawyers, I think what is important is that you are making the conscious decision to set the boundary and you're being thoughtful about it, even if at some point you decide, kind of like you're playing around with right now, like maybe there's some wiggle room here, right? Like we don't have to be so rigid with boundaries that we snap or that we break relationships or break ourselves. I think it's also important to realize that like there are certain times in our life where we need to be more rigid with our boundaries. And there are times in our life where we can be a little more flexible. And I think that having that recognition, it just understanding that might help people be a little more willing to kind of dip their toe in the water when it comes to setting boundaries, right? Like if you set a boundary, it doesn't mean that you have to it doesn't mean it's written in stone, right? You can evolve your boundaries. Another thing is like maybe you're in a period of your life where boundaries with partners, it's not possible, right? For whatever reason at this point in your life. Maybe in the future, you're like, I have to set boundaries. I mean, there are points in my life where I was like, I have to set boundaries, or I'm going to have to, and like I said, maybe I didn't call it boundaries, but I have to kind of have some rules here, or I'm going to have some mental health challenges dealing with these people. So setting those boundaries, again, be open to letting them expand and contract as needed. And again, that I think that really depends on your season of life, what your mental health is at any given point. And when I say season of life, like if you have children who love to play soccer, like you can't say, I'm not leaving the house after 6 p.m. or whatever. That's not a great example. But like, if you have children, like your boundaries in life are going to be a little different than if you are an empty nester, if that makes sense, right? Because you have different things going on. So boundaries can approach them as if they are not like a concrete wall, but one that is much more flexible than a concrete wall.
Yeah, I think that's really a lovely way to look at it. I think that notion of boundaries as being something that's seasonal, right? They will be different depending on the season of your life. I think that's such a beautiful way of describing it. And the idea that boundaries don't have to be this super rigid concrete wall, right? That there's some flexibility there, that there are going to be times where you can loosen up on the boundary and there's other times where you're going to want to be more firm about it. What I'm also reading between the lines and what I've experienced and seen elsewhere is that boundaries come over time, right? As you build up in your practice, as you establish yourself, as you get more confidence in terms of I'll use the word security. I don't know if that's exactly the right word, but ability perhaps to generate work and provide value. I think it becomes a little bit more palatable perhaps to go and set those boundaries and take the risks that come along with setting boundaries. Because with some people, you're going to set that boundary and you run the risk of that person wanting somebody who doesn't have that boundary, right? If it's a professional environment and it's a client, they want that 24/7 service. And you're saying, well, actually, I don't do that service. And that's what I've seen among practitioners who have developed their own independent practices, who say that that's one of the things that they really screen for, right? When they're taking on clients, because they have sole discretion over who comes in and who doesn't. I mean, at least if you're at a stage where your practice is now sufficiently sustainable, right? At the very beginning, we take whoever, right? It's just building the business. But once you start having the ability to be discerning, is this client going to be one who is expecting me to respond to emails at 8 o'clock at night, 9 o'clock at night, 6 a.m. Saturday morning, whatever that looks like. And when you have the choice of not working with those people, your world looks so much different. So
looks so much better.
So much better. Yeah. I mean, unless maybe you like answering emails at 6 a.m. I confess I probably do that sometimes, but that's not because I love it. It's just how my life is structured.
Sure.
The windows in my crazy life that I get to sit at my computer. But yeah, it's so interesting. We talked before we hit the record button today about self-advocacy. And I'd love for us to chat a little bit about that. And I think it ties in with the concept of boundaries. I think it also ties in with one of the questions that I had for you, which was dealing with the feelings of overwhelm and burnout and maybe frustration that can arise in the context of a legal practice. And I'd love to know what your thoughts are and what your recommendations are for anybody who is struggling with those things, which often are related to the boundaries question when you don't have boundaries.
Yeah. I mean, a part of me is like, wants to say, let's set some boundaries, right? And a lot of times, like the boundary issue doesn't really come up until you're like, oh, I need to set a boundary, right? Like it's hard to foresee the issue. I mean, I think you get better, in terms of overwhelm and burnout. One thing that I know that really impacted my mental health is the clients I work with. I've worked with clients who just light me up, like in a good way, right? That I'm just like, I will do anything for them. I might not respond to them on, Saturday morning at 6 a.m., but, they're just a joy to work with. Right. And those that make me feel valuable. But I've also had clients, and I've learned from this, that are a complete drag. And that a lot of times when I look back on it, those are the clients that led me to just burn out. Right. Like just having these feelings of like, I am so over it. And really, really, this takes a lot of practice. And again, it's so much harder as a young lawyer or a new lawyer, but really looking sort of for red flags when you start getting to do some of your own client intake and vetting. If you own your own practice, like by all means, please closely vet your clients. Like you used such a great word a minute ago, be discerning. It's so much harder when you work in a firm and you're given the clients to work with. and usually the partners love to just pass on like the absolute, but at least you get to learn, right? Totally. You get to learn.
Yep.
But I remember learning, that malpractice stops at the door. And I think it's so important to have sort of those initial conversations before you start working with these clients. And the reason I want to really dig into it and harp on this is because I do think that having a bad client can make you feel burnout, right? Having a great client can make you feel excited. And these emotions can happen in the same day. I mean, I've had this happen before, right? Where you have the great client, you're like, this isn't, you just feel so happy and elated. And then like, you see the client that you're like, oh my gosh, this reminds me of the partner who would yell at me. You'd see the text message, or not the text. Don't give them your phone number. You'd see the email come through and you're thinking, oh my gosh. And then that can just completely like ruin your day. It's like a complete 380, 160, whatever.
I think that you have hit on something that is so special. And frankly, I don't hear it often enough. I think I've maybe heard it a couple of times, but often when we think of burnout, we think of time, right? Oh, you need to work fewer hours. But what you've identified is it's who you're working with. It's your client, right? And that will look different depending on where you're at in your law career. If it's at the very beginning, it's maybe the partners that you're working for. If you're like you and you have your own practice, it's truly that client, that external client.
Yeah.
And the joy that you can experience working with people who you love, where you feel valued, you feel recognized for your work, where you're making that contribution, versus where you feel that drain, right? And we've all had that experience, right? I've certainly had that experience. The name in the inbox that literally will make me feel sick to my stomach. I just have to see the name. I'm like, oh God, something horrible is happening. And so when you're surrounding yourself with those people, like you said, right, that's one of the signs or one of the ways that you might start feeling that sense of burnout. And I'd also offered to everyone listening, it's that idea of what your work is, right? I think, the red flags for the clients, I'd say the same thing for the work. And you mentioned earlier that you transitioned from, I think it was patent litigation into trademark law. So noticing that there was a certain area that felt better for you. And the more we tune in to what actually feels right for us, and I think as lawyers, we're often trained out of that whole emotional side of it. It's like, no, those are emotions. They don't factor into the equation. But when we actually start paying attention to what we want and what we like and what makes us feel joyful, happy, satisfied, then we can start shifting that area. And then that's when the boundaries come in, right? That's when you can start realizing, okay, here's where I need to start setting up some boundaries. Over here, the work that I don't want to do, the clients that I would like to move away from. And then you can create your path moving toward the work that you do want to do and the clients that you do want to be working with. So I love that you've highlighted that with burnout, because lawyers typically are hardworking, high achieving. I don't think any of us is allergic to hard work. It's the type of the work. And is the work lighting us up and bringing us more energy, or is it really sapping on our energy and making us feel exhausted and overwhelmed and like we don't want to do this anymore? So thank you.
Yeah.
I think that's a great response.
Yeah, no, I think it's so important to be open to evolving your practice area. I think that I'm not sure how it is in Canada, but in the US, a lot of people kind of, when they get out of law school, they start in a practice area. And a lot of times they kind of dig in, right? They seem to dig into that practice area. And just by the way it's structured, it's not encouraged to jump out of a certain practice area 3 to 5 years down the road. But, if you're not loving your practice area, if you don't love the work that you do, your clients will feel it. And I think it will reflect in your work, right? If you love the work that you do, you'll have an amazing work product. If you're thinking you want to, explore different practice areas, maybe set a boundary of only working in like the one that's making you unhappy for 6 hours that day, and maybe spend an hour or two that day really seeing what you can do in terms of, another practice area that interests you, or some business development in that area, or maybe there's mentorship opportunities somewhere, an attorney that you can work with, that type of thing. Because really, time is way too short. Time is our most valuable asset. And once it is gone, you can make more money, but you can't get time back. And it sucks to look back and think about a certain time period of your life where you were absolutely miserable in a situation, right? A practice area or a law firm partner you worked with. So, you owe it to yourself to get into that place and find the practice area that brings you joy. And maybe it's not practicing law, and that's okay too.
Yeah, I think that's so well said, Suzi. And I think what you've touched on in addition is with that example in particular, where you're setting that boundary of, say, 6 hours of one type of work, and you introduce an hour of a new type of work. I think setting boundaries with ourselves is also something that we need to learn how to do. And I can tell you, I'm in a boundary setting stage of my practice where it's looking at all the different options and saying, wow, everything looks so amazing. I want to do all these different things, but having to decide on what I will spend my time on, because again, it's setting those boundaries at an individual level to make sure that you're aligned with where it is that you want to ultimately go. Suzi, I'm looking at the clock. I'm thinking we don't have a ton more time, which is sad because I have so many more questions for you. But one of the questions that I really want us to cover is your community, Legally Blissed. And I would love to know more about that. And one of the things that you said kind of reminds me of this. You mentioned when you started practicing, which is when I started practicing, I think 2003-ish.
The olden days.
Around there, there wasn't a Facebook, there weren't podcasts, there wasn't access to the information like we're sharing in today's episode, right? This was just not part of the dialogue. You had to go to a special seminar, or you had to find somebody that was willing to share their story with you, whereas now this information is more available. So this notion of community in practice. And so you've formed a community, and I would love to hear more about what it is and what inspired you to create it.
Yeah. So thank you so much for asking, Paula. So when I, look back on my career, and after having discussions with, hundreds of female lawyers over the years, not just via my podcast, but, just being around female lawyers, after having gone through the pandemic and what I saw female attorneys kind of taking on, I realized that we are really great advocates for other people. Female lawyers are the best lawyers. We're amazing lawyers, but we're not great at advocating for ourselves. I think that there is a lot of lack in self-care for ourselves. There's a lot of lack in setting boundaries. We don't say no. You were just now mentioning about all of these opportunities, which sounds like, that is a fantastic place to be in, where you can look at, all of these opportunities, but at the same time, I think that we say yes to too many things. We say yes to things that don't necessarily align with our values, which is also something I think is really important, is that we dig into what our values are even before we set our goals, because we may end up having reached a goal and being not super fulfilled, right? If we're not aligned with our values. And I think that's something we don't really sit down to do. So the community itself is for women who are feeling burnt out. Maybe they're in a place where they're really needing to make a big decision, or they're feeling overwhelmed, and, they're desiring a community of other women who may be a few steps ahead of them. Like the vision of the community really is to have women who are kind of fresh out of law school, as well as women who have been out, a couple of years, like you and I, like us.
Just a couple.
Just a couple, right? And the community, it's a private mentor-led community, and it's for transforming female attorneys into self-advocates. So I wanted it to be mentor-led because even though I'm the founder and the facilitator of the community, I envision the community evolving over the years to really meet the needs of the members specifically. And I want the mentor specifically to guide the content and the culture of the community.
I love that. I think it's such a wonderful way of bringing people together, and that sort of, I don't know how to describe it, but the fact that women lawyers are such great advocates for others, and yet to advocate for oneself is such a different skill set or experience. Yeah. And so often you see these women who are so amazing at, they get up there, they do all the things for everybody else, but it's really hard for them to do it for themselves. So I love that you have created a container, an environment where women can get together and to reinforce each other. I can fully imagine myself dipping into the community and saying, hey guys, I've got this question, right? Here's a boundary situation.
Right.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because it's helpful. I mean, ultimately we make our own decisions. We decide based on our values and what's important to us and what our boundaries are, what's going to be a yes, what's going to be a no. But creating community for that, I think, is such a wonderful thing. So love that you've done that.
What you were saying a minute ago about, I kind of have this boundary issue, like I'm not really sure what to do. Like you can go talk to your husband about it, right? Sure. But, he doesn't want to hear like your work issue, right? Like maybe he does, but the community really is kind of for that very thing, right? Like I'm having a problem setting a boundary. Is this a situation where I should set a boundary? Or, oh, guys, I need some support because I kind of cheated on a boundary, right? I let someone, because we're human and we do things like that, right? But the point of that community really is to help women have that support and help us really deprogram what we've been taught about how we are supposed to, quote unquote, show up as lawyers, because, we've been trained to show up a certain way. And there, I look at the younger generations of lawyers coming out, young females, and they're really like kind of bucking the trends. And I love seeing that, or bucking tradition. So I think that's kind of cool.
I love that. And I think also going back to one of your initial points about your relationships with your clients, I think when you're speaking the same language, right, you can try to explain that to your husband, who might at this stage understand everything, having heard all the stories.
Right.
But when you're speaking to people who are experiencing the same things, who understand what you're going through, there's just that instant bond and sense of community. So I think they've
been lawyers as well, right? Like everyone in the community, it is application or invitation only, and everyone in the community has a JD. And the vast majority have practiced law at some point. Like I think there's one member who hasn't practiced law, but she went to law school. So, there is that kind of that common bond that runs through the community. I think that's really special. If we made it through law school together, wherever we went to law school, even if it's in different locations geographically or different, time periods, there's still that bond of like having gone through it, right? Of having gone. And, you did the thing, you did the law school, you took the law school exams, you did the Socratic method, you were cold called upon. Like we all have those kind of commonalities there.
You describe it with such beauty. Those are the experiences that for so many of us, they stand out as things that we experienced during law school, where it's like, it connects us, it bonds us. And I think it's, law school attracts a similar type of person sometimes. So,
sure.
Suzi, I'm loving this conversation. And I'm also cognizant of having to wrap things up. I feel like we could chat for hours.
No, I know.
So I have one last question for you, which is if you went back to yourself graduating from law school, what advice would you give her?
Spend almost as much time networking and making connections as you are grinding and billing. It's really hard.
Such good advice. Yes.
It's really hard when you're like, billing with like 200 hours. But, it fascinates me because I think women are not super great about this because we are super great about being diligent and getting our work done and meeting client expectations or partner expectations. But do you remember who was walking around the law firm making connections with people, right? It was Richard going around, leaning up against people's door. What people remember Richard, they remember the connections that they made with Richard, right? They don't remember, Suzi, the great little associate who got her work done. They remember the connections. They remember that networking. So I think that we underestimate the importance of networking, even at that early stage. And we overestimate perfect work product, which I have to be careful about because I know how it is, right? Like you don't want to get yelled at if you forgot to dot an I or cross a T because we strive for perfection, but don't be striving for perfection in that work product at the expense of getting out there and networking and meeting people because your network, as corny as it might sound, is your net worth. And especially more so as your practice continues to evolve in anything that you do in life.
Yeah, I think that's such great advice. Thank you so much, Suzi. It has been amazing having you here today. I'm so delighted to have you here. I know everyone listening has learned so much from our conversation, from hearing what you have to share. And for anybody who's looking to find you, we'll put all of this in the show notes. So don't worry, you don't have to, if you're listening, you don't have to scribble this down on a napkin, although you can. But where can people find you?
So I'm on Instagram and Twitter. My handle is Suzi Nixon, SUZIHIXON. And you can also find me on my website, which actually, no, you're not going to actually find me on my website, but you can learn more about me at legallybliss.com.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Suzi. Thank you. And thank you everybody for joining us today. This has been so much fun and conversation to be continued.
Thank you so much for having me, Paula. It's been great.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye. Take care, Suzi. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.